the humiliation. The glass doors of the Skylift Airlines first-class lounge reflected the late afternoon sun like a shield of polished silver. Travelers in designer coats and tailored suits swept in and out as if through the gates of a private kingdom. Marcus Blake stood just outside those doors unnoticed, his figure a quiet silhouette against the glowing airport concourse. He wore a wrinkled blue shirt, plain dark jeans, and an old leather backpack slung carelessly over one shoulder. His beard was flecked with gray, his glasses simple, his shoes worn from years of travel. To any observer, he looked like a man of little importance, perhaps a teacher, a modest businessman, or a weary traveler heading home after years abroad. What no one saw, what no one even guessed, was that this man was the very founder and chief executive officer of Skylift Airlines, one of the most powerful names in aviation. Today, however, Marcus was not here as the CEO. He was here under another name on a quiet mission he had prepared for months. He approached the polished reception desk slowly, the faint buzz of luggage wheels and overhead announcements filling the air around him. The attendant at the desk, Sarah Jennings, did not smile when she looked up at him. Her eyes flicked over his appearance in a quick, practiced sweep: the creased shirt, the lack of an expensive watch, the slightly tired shoes, and already her mouth had tightened into a polite but cold expression. "Good afternoon, sir," she said, her voice level, stripped of warmth. "May I see your lounge card?" Marcus slid the sleek membership card across the counter without hesitation. The card was real, embossed with his name in crisp silver lettering. He had flown first class on his airline more times than he could count. Yet as Sarah studied the card, her frown deepened slightly. She tapped the screen in front of her, slowly, as though doubting every letter of his name. "Sir, I'll need to re-verify your information," she added after a long pause, her eyes rising again to assess him with an air of suspicion. "This lounge is reserved exclusively for first-class passengers." Marcus's chest tightened, though his face remained unreadable. The words were spoken with practiced courtesy, yet they sliced at him like a hidden blade. He knew this moment would come. He had been preparing for it, but still the sting was sharp. He nodded silently, pocketed the card, and stepped back from the counter. He did not argue. He did not declare his identity. He simply waited, standing off to the side, as if he were invisible. It was in that silence, at that exact moment, that the scene unfolded which would brand itself into his mind forever. A young white man in a tailored gray suit entered briskly, his steps confident, his watch gleaming under the ceiling lights. Sarah's face transformed instantly into a bright smile, her eyes sparkling with recognition. "Welcome back, Mr. Cole," she said warmly. "Seat 1A as usual. Your favorite scotch is ready." She didn't ask for his card, didn't type anything into the computer, didn't hesitate for a single moment. The man chuckled and replied with easy familiarity, "Thank you, Sarah. You always take care of me." He walked past the desk, the glass doors sliding open smoothly as though bowing to his importance. In a flash, he was inside, sipping his drink, enjoying his privilege. Marcus remained where he was, alone in the waiting area, watching the scene unfold from behind the frosted glass. He lowered himself into one of the stiff public chairs just beyond the lounge doors, his worn backpack resting against his feet. He took a long breath, steadying himself, and then pulled a battered leather notebook from his coat pocket. The notebook was old, its edges frayed, the pages filled with neat, careful handwriting. He opened to a fresh sheet and wrote in quiet strokes, "October 10th, Atlanta to Los Angeles. Lounge access denied due to appearance. Attendant, Sarah Jennings." White passenger Cole admitted without verification. Warm greeting. Scotch offered. He paused, looking at the words as if they burned his sight. This was not the first time he had written such an entry. In fact, it was the 23rd time in the last 2 weeks. But today, it was different. Today, the victim was not a stranger, not a nameless traveler whose story he might later hear secondhand. Today, the victim was him, the man who had built this company with his own 2 hands. As he closed the notebook gently, Marcus's mind drifted back to the first days of Skylift Airlines. He remembered the small, rented office space, the sleepless, nights poring over financial statements, the thrill of buying the first aircraft, the pride of painting his logo across its shining fuselage. His dream had been simple then, to build an airline where every passenger felt respected, no matter their background, no matter their appearance. He had sworn that dignity would be the foundation of his company. Yet here he was, decades later, standing outside his own lounge, excluded by employees trained under a system that had slowly turned into something he no longer recognized. His dream had been tarnished, twisted by subtle prejudice and silent bias that now flowed through the veins of Skylift Airlines like a hidden poison. He rubbed his temples slowly, his jaw tight, but his eyes calm and clear. He knew better than to cause a scene. He knew that anger in this moment would only cloud the truth he needed to see. This was not about Marcus Blake's pride, nor about a single insult. It was about the culture of a company that had forgotten its values. He opened the notebook again, flipping back through its earlier pages. Each entry told the same story in different words. Black passengers stopped for extra verification. Elderly travelers left to struggle while attendants hurried past. Casual clothes met with suspicion while tailored suits opened every door. Each name, each date, each small humiliation was carefully recorded in his neat handwriting. And with every page, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility pressing harder on his shoulders. He had created this airline. He had trusted his managers to protect its soul, and they had failed him. His gaze lifted to the lounge again, watching. Sarah laughed lightly with Mr. Cole, offering him an extra napkin with his drink, her smile genuine and bright. Marcus's lips pressed into a thin line. He did not hate her. He did not even blame her alone. What he saw in her was not merely a personal failure, but the reflection of a deeper sickness, a sickness that had been allowed to grow unchecked within the walls of his company. He shut the notebook with a firm snap and slid it back into his coat pocket. The time for observation was not over yet, but already a fire was kindling in his chest. He had seen enough to know the truth. His company was rotting. And now, whether it cost him comfort, reputation, or friendships at the highest level, he would tear that rot out by the roots. When his flight was called over the speakers, Marcus rose slowly, shouldered his old backpack, and walked past the lounge one last time. Sarah did not look at him. Mr. Cole was laughing at some private joke inside, glass raised in a toast. Marcus did not slow, did not glance back, did not speak. His steps were steady, his eyes straight ahead. He had been humiliated, yes, but, more importantly, he had been awakened. For years he had suspected, for years he had heard whispers, but today he had seen it clearly for himself. Tomorrow, he promised silently. Tomorrow everything would begin to change. The undercover passenger. The cabin lights dimmed as Flight 472 leveled off into the quiet altitude of 36,000 feet. The hum of the engines filled the air like a steady heartbeat, and the passengers began to settle into their seats for the long trip westward. Marcus Blake sat in the last row of economy class, squeezed between a young college student hunched over a gaming device and an elderly woman who clutched her handbag with nervous fingers. It was the kind of seat he had not occupied in decades, a place far removed from the polished first-class suites and private lounges that bore the weight of his company's reputation. But this was exactly where he wanted to be. Hidden in plain sight, he was not the powerful CEO, not the man who had signed billion-dollar contracts or attended government summits. Tonight, he was simply Jim Carter, an ordinary passenger, eyes sharp and mind steady, watching every detail unfold around him. From his vantage point in the back, Marcus saw everything. He saw the attendants glide briskly down the aisle, their smiles faint and mechanical, their eyes skimming over some passengers while lingering warmly on others. He saw how the crew bent down eagerly to offer extra snacks to a young man in a sharp Italian suit, while walking past a weary mother juggling two restless children without even a nod. He saw how elderly passengers struggled with luggage, how polite requests were brushed aside, and how people of color often faced narrowed eyes and unnecessary questions. Each moment felt like another small stone dropping into the heavy bucket of his heart. weighing him down with both sorrow and determination. Half an hour into the flight, Marcus noticed an older gentleman sitting 3 rows ahead. The man's hands trembled slightly as he tried to stow a heavy carry-on bag in the overhead bin. He was clearly struggling, his back bent, his face tight with strain. A flight attendant passed by, young, tall, with a polished name tag that read Chris Doyle. Marcus leaned forward, expecting Chris to help. Instead, the attendant glanced at the man briefly, then turned his head and quickened his pace toward a sharply dressed passenger further down the aisle. The bag remained half lifted. The elderly man left to fumble alone until another passenger, equally old, stood up and offered assistance. Marcus clenched his jaw, his knuckles tightening around the edge of his notebook. He had promised himself to stay silent, to watch without interfering, but the sight carved deeply into his patience. Later in the flight, a middle-aged man across the aisle caught Marcus's attention. His name, Marcus would soon learn, was Walter Hayes, and he had the kind of quiet dignity that made an impression even in silence. Walter wore a simple sweater and slacks, nothing fancy, nothing that drew attention. At one point, shivering slightly, he pressed the call button. When the attendant, Diane Walker, appeared, Walter asked politely, "Excuse me, ma'am, may I have a blanket? It's a bit cold." Diane's brow furrowed, her lips pressed together in a flat line, and she shook her head. "I'm sorry, sir. We're completely out of blankets on this flight." Walter smiled faintly, nodded, and withdrew his request, his dignity intact despite the rejection. Marcus's eyes, however, never left Diane as she moved down the aisle. Barely 5 minutes later, Marcus saw her return with a folded blanket in hand, her face glowing with warmth as she leaned toward a younger white man in a tailored blazer. "Here you go, sir," she said sweetly. "If you need anything else, just let me know." The words, the smile, the eagerness, it was everything she had denied Walter only moments before. Marcus felt something inside him crack. He did not speak, but he reached for his notebook with slow, deliberate hands, his pen scratched across the paper. Flight 472, passenger Walter Hayes, black, mid-50s. Asked politely for blanket. Denied. Same request granted minutes later to white passenger in blazer. Attendant, Diane Walker. He underlined the names twice, the pressure of his pen cutting faint grooves into the paper. These were not just observations now. These were records, evidence, truths that could no longer be hidden beneath glossy advertising or polished corporate speeches. As the flight wore on, Marcus listened closely to the rhythms of the cabin. He heard the soft complaints of ignored passengers, the hollow apologies offered without sincerity, the quiet frustration of those who felt invisible, and he contrasted those moments with the laughter of the favored, the clink of glasses offered freely, the casual comfort extended to those who looked the part of wealth and privilege. It was not a single mistake or an isolated incident. It was a pattern, consistent and undeniable, a thread of prejudice woven tightly into the daily fabric of his airline. Marcus thought of the years when he had built Skylift Airlines from nothing. He remembered standing on the tarmac beside the first jet he ever purchased, a second-hand aircraft with worn seats and fading paint. He remembered promising his small team of employees that they would be different, that they would serve with respect, that they would honor every passenger, no matter who they were. He had sworn that his company would not simply fly people across the skies, but would carry them with dignity. Now, as he watched Walter Hayes pull his thin sweater tighter around his shoulders, Marcus felt the sting of betrayal, not by Walter, not by the passengers, but by his own managers, his own system, his own dream that had been twisted into something he could barely recognize. When the plane touched down in Los Angeles, the passenger stood, shuffling toward the exit. Marcus stayed seated, letting the rows ahead of him clear first. He watched Diane smile brightly as she thanked the passengers she favored, her voice rich with cheer, while those she overlooked received nothing more than a flat, mechanical goodbye. Walter Hayes shuffled slowly past, nodding politely, at Diane, who barely acknowledged him. Marcus rose only when the aisle was nearly empty, slipping his notebook back into his backpack. He walked off the plane without speaking to anyone, his mind heavy, his purpose sharper than ever. As he stepped into the terminal, The flood of neon lights and bustling voices washed over him. But Marcus did not see the crowds. He saw only the faces in his notebook, the Sarahs, the Dianes, the Chris Doyles, people who had once been trusted to uphold his values, now tarnishing them with every biased smile and every cold dismissal. He walked through the airport with quiet determination, his steps steady, his eyes forward. Tonight had confirmed what he feared. This was not about one lounge attendant or one flight crew. This was about a culture that had been allowed to rot under the watch of a management team, too blind or too indifferent to notice. Marcus adjusted the strap of his backpack and whispered to himself as he left the terminal, "I didn't build this airline for the chosen few. I built it for everyone, and if I have to tear it down brick by brick to remind them, then so be it." The night air outside the terminal was cool against his face, and with every breath his resolve grew stronger. His undercover mission was not yet finished. More flights, more lounges, more observations lay ahead. But the storm gathering in Marcus, Blake's chest was no longer just a quiet anger. It was a fire, and soon it would burn through every lie his company had hidden behind. The gathering storm. The boardroom of Skylift Airlines towered high above the city skyline, a glass-walled chamber that gleamed with power and prestige. The table stretched long and polished, surrounded by leather chairs where men and women in expensive suits gathered to speak of profits, strategies, and market share. It was here that the future of the airline was decided, not in the cabins or at the gates, but in the cold arithmetic of spreadsheets projected on screens. On this particular morning, Marcus Blake entered quietly, wearing his unassuming disguise. His jeans and simple blazer marked him as out of place among the tailored elegance of the executives. Nobody recognized him as their CEO, for his beard and glasses gave him the look of a tired mid-level consultant, perhaps a minor contractor allowed to observe the proceedings. He took a seat in the back corner, a silent shadow, watching and listening. What he heard chilled him far more than the humiliations of the lounge or the injustices of the flights. The conversation among his senior managers carried an unmistakable tone, sharp, calculating, and stripped of the very values Marcus had built the company upon. "Our premium passengers are the ones who drive the revenue," said a sleek man with slicked back hair named Harold Pierce, head of customer strategy. "We need to make sure our staff prioritize them. Every smile, every drink, every ounce of attention should be reserved for the clientele that matters." A few heads nodded around the table. Another executive, Linda Moore, director of operations, added, "We've noticed that when staff focus too much on passengers who don't fit the profile, service ratings drop. People want to feel like they're part of an elite experience, not standing in line with, well, let's just say, with those who don't belong." She let the words trail off, but the meaning was clear. The room chuckled lightly, as though it were an accepted truth rather than a dangerous idea. Marcus sat utterly still, his hands folded tightly under the table. Every instinct in him screamed to rise, to shout, to slam his fist against the polished wood and remind them what Skylift Airlines had been created for. But he didn't. Not yet. Instead, he drew out his notebook and scribbled quietly, his pen etching every word with careful fury. Management openly instructs staff to prioritize wealthy passengers based on appearance. Language reveals bias reinforced at the highest level. Names: Harold Pierce, Linda Moore. Date: October 12th. He underlined it twice, pressing so hard the pen nearly tore through the page. His heart thudded with anger, but his mind remained clear. The disease was not confined to a few attendants. It was festering in the leadership itself, poisoning every decision, trickling downward until it shaped the very culture of his airline. As the meeting continued, Marcus heard more: plans to introduce new discretionary service rules that would give staff freedom to filter passengers in lounges and on flights, selective training sessions emphasizing customer appearance and presentation, discussions about cutting corners in economy service while pouring resources into first-class perks. Each word landed like a hammer blow against the foundation of his dream. He remembered the early days when he had stood before his first group of employees, just 20 people gathered in a rented hangar. and told them that respect would be their signature. He had promised them that no matter how the company grew, no matter how many billions they earned, no one would ever feel invisible on his airline. That promise echoed in his mind now, drowned out by the shallow laughter of his managers as they celebrated how much revenue their strategies would generate in the next quarter. After the meeting adjourned, Marcus lingered in the hallway, leaning against a marble column as executives filed past, their conversations brisk and self-assured. They didn't glance at him, didn't pause, didn't suspect that the man in worn shoes scribbling in a leather notebook was the very person whose name they toasted at investor dinners. He let them pass, then slowly walked down the hall to the large window overlooking the runway. Outside, aircraft painted in the proud blue and gold of Skylift Airlines glided across the tarmac, their engines roaring, their wings slicing through the air with power. To the world, these planes were symbols of success. To Marcus at that moment, they looked like vessels carrying a lie that his managers had built upon his name, hiding corruption behind glossy brochures and luxury branding. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, older now, weathered eyes heavy with disappointment. He whispered under his breath, almost as though speaking to his younger self, "This is not what we built. This is not what we dreamed." That evening, Marcus returned to his modest hotel room, the city lights glowing beyond the window like a restless sea. He sat at the desk, opened his notebook, and spread out the pages before him. Each entry, each incident, each overheard conversation formed a mosaic of betrayal. The faces of Sarah Jennings, Diane Walker, Chris Doyle, Harold Pierce, Linda Moore, all stared back at him from the inked pages, silent witnesses to the corruption that had infected his company. He read them slowly, one by one, feeling the weight of every story. The elderly man struggling with luggage, the blanket denied to Walter Hayes, the lounge doors closed to himself, the executives laughing about the clientele that mattered. He placed his pen down and let his head rest heavily in his hands. It was no longer a matter of suspicion or doubt. The evidence was complete, undeniable. His company was no longer the dream he had built. It had become a machine, efficient in profit, cruel in spirit. And yet, beneath the sorrow, something else stirred. A storm was gathering within him, not the wild storm of rage, but the steady storm of resolve. Marcus had faced hardship before. He had been a young black entrepreneur in a world that doubted him at every step, laughed at his ambitions, told him no bank would ever fund his dream of building an airline. He had faced rejection after rejection, humiliation after humiliation, but he had pressed forward, and he had built Skylift from nothing into a global force. Now he realized that he was standing at another such crossroads. His company was lost, not beyond saving, but lost all the same. And just as he had fought to create it, he would fight again to reclaim it. He picked up his pen one final time that night and wrote across a fresh page in bold strokes, words that seemed to thunder from his heart onto the paper. Tomorrow, the tie masks come off. He stared at the sentence until the ink dried, then closed the notebook with a decisive snap. The gathering storm in his chest had taken its full shape. He was done observing, done waiting, done recording. It was time to confront. It was time to remind Skylift Airlines of its soul, or to rip out the rot with his own hands if that was the only way. Outside his window, the city lights flickered, and the storm rolled silently across the horizon, promising that the calm was ending and the reckoning was near. The confrontation. The morning sun poured through the wide glass walls of Skylift Airlines headquarters, casting golden light across the marble floors and polished metal pillars. The lobby hummed with the usual rhythm of corporate life. Assistants rushing with files, managers greeting each other with false smiles, executives checking their watches as though time itself answered to them. Marcus Blake entered through the revolving doors, but this time he was no shadow, no undercover traveler in wrinkled shirts. He wore a tailored suit of deep charcoal, a crisp white shirt, and a navy tie that carried the quiet weight of authority. His leather shoes echoed against the marble as he walked, and though his face remained calm, his presence filled the space with an energy no one could ignore. Employees glanced at him, puzzled, whispering to each other as they realized the man, who looked so ordinary in jeans and glasses days ago, now carried himself like a figure from another world. And he was. The boardroom waited above, and Marcus climbed the elevator in silence, his notebook pressed firmly in his hand. When the doors opened, the corridor leading to the boardroom stretched ahead like a battlefield before the first charge. He paused for only a moment, looking out at the runways visible in the distance, planes painted in skylifts blue and gold roaring into the sky. His chest tightened. Those planes bore his dream, his name, his reputation. But today, the truth would break open like a storm and not everyone would walk away untouched. Inside the boardroom, the executives were already gathered. Harold Pierce adjusted his cufflinks, Linda Moore scrolled briskly through a tablet, and several vice presidents chatted idly about market shares and quarterly bonuses. None of them expected what was about to unfold. When Marcus entered, the room fell into an uneasy silence. At first, no one recognized him. They saw only a tall man with commanding presence, a serious expression, and a calmness that seemed almost out of place. Then, one by one, their eyes widened. Murmurs rose like a wave around the table. Is that Marcus Blake? It can't be. But he hasn't been to a board meeting in months. The whispers trailed off as Marcus set his notebook down on the table with deliberate care and looked around the room. Good morning, he said, his voice steady, low, but carrying to every corner of the room. It has been some time since I've joined one of these meetings. I wanted to see for myself what this company has become. No one spoke. Harold Pierce leaned back, forcing a nervous chuckle, trying to regain control of the moment. Marcus, what a surprise. You should have let us know. You didn't need to trouble yourself with the day-to-day. We have things well in hand. Marcus's eyes locked on him, and the silence that followed was heavier than any words. Then, with a slow motion, Marcus opened the notebook, flipping through page after page until he reached the very beginning. You say you have things well in hand, he said quietly, but I've been flying under another name for the last 2 weeks. I've walked through our lounges, sat in our cabins, stood in our lines, and what I have seen, his voice hardened, is not a company in good hands. What I have seen is a company that has lost its soul. He began to read. Each page, each entry, his voice rolled like thunder across the table. October 10th, Atlanta to Los Angeles. First-class lounge access denied due to appearance. Attendant, Sarah Jennings. White passenger admitted without verification, greeted warmly, served scotch. October 11th, Denver. Elderly black passenger left to struggle with heavy bag while staff ignored her. Attendant, Diane Walker. White passenger assisted immediately. October 12th. Flight 472. Walter Hayes, black, mid-50s, denied blanket. White. Passenger received blanket minutes later. Attendant, Diane Walker again. October the 12th. Board meeting. Harold Pierce instructs staff to prioritize wealthy-looking passengers. Linda Moore supports with language that explicitly devalues those who don't fit the profile. Each name struck the air like a hammer. Each story was another nail in the coffin of their denials. As Marcus read, faces grew pale. Linda shifted in her seat, her lips pressing thin. Harold's confident smirk faltered into a nervous twitch. Around the table, the other managers sat frozen, unable to hide from the evidence that poured forth like a flood. Marcus closed the notebook with a heavy snap, the sound echoing like a judge's gavel. This, he said firmly, is my company. This is my dream. And you have turned it into something unrecognizable. I founded Skylift Airlines to serve every passenger with dignity, to show the world that respect is not a luxury, but a right. Yet under your leadership, you have allowed discrimination to take root. You have mocked my values behind these walls. You have corrupted the very heart of what we stand for. Harold finally spoke, his voice rising with forced bravado. Marcus, let's be reasonable. These are isolated incidents. You can't take a few stories and paint the entire company as broken. We've grown too big for you to micromanage like in the old days. This is how modern airlines survive, by catering to the elite, by protecting the brand image. It's business, Marcus, nothing more. Marcus's eyes narrowed, his voice cutting through the air like steel. Business is not an excuse for cruelty. Profit is not an excuse for prejudice. If this is how you define survival, then you do not belong in this company. Linda tried to interject, her words stumbling over themselves. We only meant to strengthen the service model. Marcus raised a hand, silencing her instantly. His voice was calm but unyielding. Strength built on discrimination is weakness, and weakness at the top spreads like a poison through every level below. I have seen it with my own eyes, heard it with my own ears, and written it in this book. There is no debate. There is no excuse. He stepped away from the table and turned toward the wide glass wall that overlooked the runways. For a moment, he let the silence settle like dust, giving each of them time to feel the weight of what was happening. Then he spoke again, his words slow and deliberate. If you cannot treat every passenger with respect, then you cannot work here. If you cannot uphold the values this airline was built upon, then you cannot lead here. Today, this ends. He turned back, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces. Effective immediately, this entire management team is dismissed. The words landed like a lightning strike. Shock rippled through the room, gasps breaking out, voices rising in protest. You can't. This is outrageous. Marcus, you'll destroy everything. But his voice cut through the chaos, strong and final. No, he said firmly. I am saving everything. The room fell silent again, the weight of his authority undeniable. Security personnel, already alerted by Marcus earlier, stepped quietly into the room. Their presence left no question about what was happening. One by one, the executives rose, their faces tight with disbelief, anger, or shame. Harold muttered, curses under his breath. Linda's eyes glistened with frustrated tears. Others simply lowered their heads in defeat. Marcus did not gloat. He did not raise his voice or celebrate his victory. He simply watched as the people who had betrayed his dream filed out, leaving behind only their empty chairs and the echo of their failure. When the last door closed, Marcus remained standing at the head of the table, his notebook still resting before him. He placed a hand on its worn leather cover and exhaled slowly. For the first time in weeks, his heart felt lighter. The confrontation was not the end, but it was the beginning of something new, a rebirth, a cleansing. He knew the hard work still lay ahead. He would have to rebuild the culture, retrain the staff, and restore the trust of countless passengers. But the storm had broken, and the cleansing rain had begun. Outside the glass walls, a skylift jet soared into the morning sky, sunlight glinting off its wings. Marcus watched it rise, his eyes steady, his voice low, a promise to himself and to everyone who would ever board his planes again. This airline will fly with dignity, or it will not fly at all. The firing and the rebirth. The headquarters of Skylift Airlines felt strangely quiet in the days after the confrontation. The corridors, once filled with hurried footsteps of executives barking orders and assistants rushing with clipped instructions, now carried a different air, uncertain, heavy, almost waiting. Word of the firing had spread through the company like wildfire. Entire management teams, people who had once walked with untouchable pride, were gone, escorted out by security, under the calm but uncompromising command of Marcus Blake himself. Some employees whispered in shock, others in fear, and many in secret relief. For years they had watched policies shift toward exclusion, had seen their colleagues mistreated in silence, had felt the weight of rules that seemed designed for the privileged few. Now, with those leaders gone, the ground beneath them felt unstable yet strangely hopeful. They waited to see what would come next. Marcus moved through the building with purpose, his presence steady and unmistakable. He no longer wore disguises or stood quietly in corners. He was the CEO again, but a CEO transformed, stripped of vanity and armed with a renewed sense of mission. In the largest auditorium of the headquarters, he gathered hundreds of employees for an all-staff meeting. They filled the seats, some tense, some curious, some silently cheering him on. When Marcus stepped onto the stage, the room hushed instantly. He carried no grand presentation, no glossy slideshow. He carried only his battered leather notebook, the same one in which he had written every humiliation, every incident, every betrayal of the airline's values. He placed it on the podium, rested his hands on either side, and looked out across the sea of faces. "I built this airline with a dream," Marcus began, his voice steady, filling the room with quiet power. "I dreamed of a company where every passenger, rich or poor, young or old, no matter their skin color, no matter their clothes, would be treated with respect. I dreamed of an airline where dignity was not for sale, where service was not measured by how expensive your watch was, but by how much heart we put into serving every person who trusted us with their journey." His gaze swept across the room. "But somewhere along the way we lost that dream. We let greed and prejudice take root. We allowed people at the top to convince us that respect could be reserved for the few. We forgot that respect is for everyone, and that ends today." He opened the notebook and read again, not to shame but to teach. He told the story of Walter Hayes, denied a blanket while another was offered one freely. He described the elderly woman ignored at the gate while others were helped. He spoke of lounges where appearances outweighed truth, and of boardrooms where leaders laughed about the right clientele. With each story, employees shifted in their seats, some lowering their heads in shame, others nodding as if finally hearing their own unspoken frustrations given voice. Marcus closed the notebook with finality. "This book is not just a record of what went wrong," he said. "It is a mirror we must all look into. Because this is not just about Sarah or Diane or Harold or Linda. This is about culture, and culture is built by every one of us." Then, Marcus announced a new beginning. The management team was dissolved and a new initiative would rise in its place. Respect First, a training and service program led by employees who had proven loyalty not to profits alone but to the values of fairness and dignity. He called forward David Mitchell, the retired sales director who had once told him of the humiliations he faced after leaving his position. David, surprised and humbled, stepped onto the stage as Marcus embraced him warmly. "This man served this airline for decades," Marcus declared, "and even after retirement, when he should have been honored, he was made to feel less because he didn't wear a suit. That is not who we are. David will help lead the Respect First program, and we will rebuild together." Applause filled the room, hesitant at first, then swelling like a wave of relief and belief. Marcus then spoke of new policies: anonymous reporting for discrimination, mandatory fairness training for all staff, and a restructuring of bonuses tied not to profit alone, but to customer dignity ratings. "From this day forward," he said firmly, "our success will not only be measured in dollars, it will be measured in the respect our passengers feel when they fly with us." The weeks that followed were not easy. Restructuring shook the company to its core. Some employees resisted, fearful of change, but many embraced it, inspired by Marcus's conviction. Lounges changed their standards, not for luxury, but for fairness. Flight attendants were retrained, not only in service, but in empathy. Posters went up across airports with a simple message: every passenger matters. Slowly, stories began to spread, not of humiliation but of kindness. An attendant who went out of her way to help an elderly man. A gate agent who treated a casually dressed family with the same warmth as a suited businessman. A manager who was promoted not for profit margins, but for consistently high respect scores. The culture began to heal. Marcus did not stay hidden in offices. He flew often unannounced, sitting in economy, watching, talking to passengers, thanking staff who embodied the new values. He met Walter Hayes again, inviting him to headquarters to personally apologize for his mistreatment. Walter, surprised and deeply moved, shook Marcus's hand firmly and said, "It takes courage to see what went wrong and to fix it. That's leadership." Marcus smiled, humbled, knowing the journey was far from over, but grateful that change was taking root. Months later, Marcus boarded a flight again, this time openly as himself. He did not sit in first class. He chose a seat in economy near the back, beside a young mother traveling with her child. When he entered the cabin, the flight attendants greeted him with genuine warmth, not because he was the CEO, but because they had learned to greet everyone that way. As the plane climbed into the sky, Marcus leaned back in his seat, feeling a calm he had not felt in years. He watched as the attendants helped the mother with her luggage, offered her water, and knelt to speak kindly to the child. No hesitation, no judgment, just humanity. His eyes softened and a quiet smile spread across his face. He thought back to the day he had been turned away from his own lounge, humiliated by his own staff, left waiting outside while others were welcomed in. That memory still burned, but now it was no longer just a wound. It was a reminder of why he had fought, why he had fired, why he had rebuilt. His dream had been scarred, but it had not been destroyed. He had taken back his company, not with anger alone, but with the conviction that dignity mattered more than image, and respect mattered more than luxury. As the clouds stretched endlessly beyond the window, Marcus whispered to himself, words he had carried in his heart from the very beginning. Power isn't about how high you sit, or how expensive your seat is. Power is about how you treat people when no one knows who you are. The engines roared, the aircraft soared, and Marcus closed his eyes, content at last, knowing Skylift Airlines was not only flying again, it was flying with its soul restored.